Way back in 2006, the fungal pathogen Pseudogymnoascus destructans, also known as PD, was accidentally brought into the US, first spreading throughout the Northeast, and then sweeping across the continent. The fungal pathogen doesn't affect humans, so that's good, but it does affect bats, and that's bad. When a bat gets infected with the PD fungus, it grows as a white fuzz all over the bat's face and nose, and this is how it got the name white nose syndrome. The disease itself is brutal and very dangerous. The fungus will grow all over the bat's bare skin, coating it in a powdery-looking white rot mildew, which burns lesions into their flesh. The disease is not spread through the air, but rather it's spread by bat-on-bat contact. Unfortunately, this is all too common in the caves where bats sleep, or undergo brief periods of hibernation called torpor. In this state, in this torpor in the caves, the bats are very vulnerable. Their metabolism is geared towards this torpor state, so they aren't out hunting. They're living off of their fat reserves. Everything is kind of shut down and running at a very minimal level. This includes their immune system. But because of the pathogenic infection, the bats' immune systems have to activate. They have to be turned on, and this causes their body temperature to rise. Their blood will become more acidic, and this will actually kill some cells, which will cause them to break apart and spill out their cellular guts into the bat's bloodstream. And this can lead to hyperkalemia, or a dangerously high potassium level in the blood. The bats will use up their fat stores as their body tries to remove CO2 and potassium from the blood to maintain homeostasis. But the problem is that these fat stores were originally meant to help them survive the winter, and so when the fat runs out, they die. In the 13 species of North American bats currently affected by white rot syndrome, the death rates in some populations creep up past 90%. Sometimes 100% of the infected bats die. The survival rate is extremely low, and because many of the most susceptible bat species reproduce slowly, their populations are being absolutely savaged, and they're struggling to recover. But there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and this is the news that I want to tell you about today. New research conducted by biologists at the University of Michigan have demonstrated the first evidence of genetic resistance in the bats against this white nose fungus. The researchers took tissue samples from 34 infected bats, including 25 that died from the disease and 9 that survived, and they compared them. They reported finding differences in the genes associated with regulating arousal from hibernation, echolocation, and the breakdown of fats. Doctoral student Giorgia Otteri was the first author on the paper, and she said, quote, "Because we found differences in genes associated with regulating hibernation and breakdown of fats, it could be that bats that are genetically predisposed to be a little bit fatter or to sleep more deeply are less susceptible to the disease. Changes at these genes are suggestive of evolutionary adaptation, given that white nose syndrome causes bats to arouse with unusual frequency from winter hibernation, contributing to premature depletion of fat reserves." Unquote. Dr. Lacey Knowles is a professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at U of M, and a curator at the Museum of Zoology. Dr. Knowles was Mrs. Otteri's faculty advisor and co-author of the paper. She said, quote, "This apparent adaptation occurred very quickly, involves genes with a variety of functions which likely act across seasons in order to contribute to survivorship, and has taken place despite an observable reduction in genetic diversity associated with population declines." Unquote. Alright, so essentially what they're saying is that not all the bats died from exposure to white nose syndrome, and those that survived, especially those that were able to go out and hunt after hibernation, they had enough energy to do this, and they could get some food to provide them more energy to help them recover, those bats were especially likely to survive long term. Hopefully, these hardy survivors will be able to reproduce, and pass on their hardy gene variants to their offspring. This will create new generations that are more resistant to white nose syndrome. Dr. Knowles said, quote, "As these variants increase, there is some hope that these bats are not all going to die from the disease itself." Unquote. So this is indeed a light at the end of a very dark tunnel, because for a while there, scientists were concerned that the disease was too aggressive, and that the bats would be wiped out completely. And this is actually still a serious risk, as the populations have been decimated, and they're slow to recover. But because of this newfound data, because the bats are indeed surviving in however small quantity, and developing resistance to the white nose syndrome, the situation isn't as bleak as it was before. There's a little bit of hope that North American bats will survive to see another century.